session is to make it very informal, very useful. So we're going to spend the time doing some work. We have an amazing lineup here. So if you look in your programs, you can see that we have three amazing designers, and we also have a brain scientist. So we're going to be talking about architecture and design. The format of this session will be that each speaker will just come up and give a very short briefing, so everybody is up to speed with their expertise, so you know what they're basically all about. Then we're going to get some roving microphones into the audience and take your questions. So it's not a Q&A, but you will have the chance to put your questions to these experts. So make the most of it. It's not often you get four such amazing people who you can ask questions of. Think about projects that you want to do. Think about questions that you want to have answered. And we will gather those, and then we're going to have a conversation around those questions, plus a few others that we prepared earlier. So this is the starting point, to have the briefing, gather the questions, and then debate the questions. If anybody from the sides wants to move into the middle a bit more, then please do, so we can huddle up and have a conversation together. So we're going to go in the order that we have in the program. So the first person coming up to give a quick briefing is Dr. Anjan Chatterjee, who's professor at the University of Pennsylvania.
Should I go to
just grab a lectern.
So I am the brain scientist, as I was introduced. I'm a neurologist and a cognitive neuroscientist. My clinical practice has to do with people with various kinds of cognitive disorders. And my research areas have been thinking about how our brain constructs space, and also more recently about the biology of aesthetics. I recently have launched a new research center at the University of Pennsylvania on neuroaesthetics. And I don't have any slides because I'll be giving a more formal talk shortly after this. But Liz thought it might be worth my mentioning that as part of this center, we are in the process of trying to recruit a fairly senior academic architect who is open and interested in the way that brain sciences might inform architectural practice and architectural thinking.
Thank you very much. Next up, Clodagh. Clodagh spoke this morning, but just for those of you who didn't see her speak, she's just going to give you a very quick recap of her expertise and experience. And we should have some slides that can come up just to have those running in the background, just so that you have some visuals. So if you click your clicker.
So some of you saw me talking this morning, and you will be seeing some of the same images again. I'm very fascinated by the idea of somebody who thinks about how the brain functions, to be part of my design team in future. No, you may have a job. We currently have a teacher in every modality, and we have the usual suspects of, sound engineers, construction engineers, and so on. So the more people that join together to bring wellness to a building, the happier we are. I'm based in New York, and anytime you want to come up and have an apple martini in the Big Apple, you're more than welcome to come by.
Thank you. And the next is Veronica Schreibeis Smith. So we're just going to get a very quick introduction to Veronica's work.
Okay, do we have a slideshow up?
Yeah, I did.
Okay, so for the few minutes that I have, I want to introduce our work, but also leave you with 3 ideas that might help frame the conversation we're about to have. So first of all, we must move beyond environmentalism. Secondly, we have to design architecture that nourishes the soul. And thirdly, thinking about just the architecture isn't going to be enough. So I'm not sure how many of you heard Nerio say yesterday that we have to go beyond green buildings and start thinking about wellness, and he's absolutely correct. I'm going to show you this chart that illustrates this. So we have from degenerative to regenerative structures, and then we have buildings that consume energy and resources to those that produce it. Now, the majority of buildings that we build today live here. Green buildings are better, but they still fall below the line. They still consume energy, and the fact is sometimes they're not healthy for the environment or for humans. Sustainability is right in the center, net zero buildings, and regenerative buildings start going above the line. They're healthy for humans and the planet, because at the end of the day, humans are nature, right? Well, there's another level we can take this, and that's to actually thinking about well-being. Now, the difference between health and well-being is that health might be things that you can measure easily, purity of water or air, but that's not what makes us human. We have to start thinking about emotional and spiritual qualities, the things that bring us joy and passion. And I think that there's even another level where we can actually have buildings that nourish our soul, that can elevate our consciousness. So from the yellow to the purple dots is all where wellness architecture lives. And this is a definition that was adopted by the Global Wellness Institute. You can read it later, because here's what I want you to take away. Wellness architecture is about soul. It's about natural law. It's about intuition and visceral connections that root you in landscape, culture, and your higher self. It's about beauty, and not beauty that is skin deep, but beauty that is so deep that it moves you at your core. Spaces that are not overpowering, but empowering. In this interconnected world that we live in, it becomes even more important that we design buildings that express the cultural uniqueness that brings richness to humanity. And in this digital world, it becomes even more important because of how fast we live today, that our buildings ground us and uplift us, buildings that have roots and wings. Because at the end of the day, it's the art that gives form meaning. And if you take away the art, you take away its soul. Now, Luis Longi said this, and this is a picture of him. He's my business partner and mentor. This photo was taken 10 years ago. And we know that you will never have true well-being if you don't start talking about the soul. And these ideas aren't just for tomorrow. They actually need to start being integrated today in everyday examples. This is a kitchen project that we're doing called the Vera Iconica Wellness Kitchen. And it's all about taking 1950s leftovers in our design world and realizing that they were designed around food that was heavily laden in preservatives and toxic and highly processed, and creating a revolution that will move us into a world where we can have convenience around eating living vegetable-based diets. And we have to do this in all areas, not just the kitchen. We have to integrate biophilic design, connections to views and daylight, therapeutic flooring, natural materials, spaces that are based on sacred geometry, that embrace the friends and family that gather there, and that can be adjusted to make integrating healthy wellness rituals a part of daily life. So we have to think about not just designing the architecture, but actually designing the experiences. So those are the three really big takeaways of, how to think about designing the built environment. So, thank you.
And then finally, very briefly, we have Matteo Ton, who again spoke today. So if you saw the full show, this is just a précis.
These pictures I've shown this morning, I want to show you something else. It's about the soul I learned in these days. This man in 1986, he decided to give a lecture about the 21st century, and this is the result. He never gave the lecture because he died before. He was supposed to give this at Harvard, and I come to the point number 6. He never decided what consistency means. So let me explain what my idea of consistency is. Consistency is sustainability. Consistency means, first of all, looking as an architect on durability of what technically will last as long as possible. We all have to look for money-wise for the investment. Look at this building. This building in 20 years, in 40 years, is going to be better than now. And the second part of consistency, I hope Calvino would agree, is the aesthetic consistency. What does it mean? Aesthetic consistency means step out from any fashion moment. Try to find simplicity, try to find things they last visually as long as possible. And that's why my architecture and my interior and my design is quite boring, because it's so simple. Thank you.
So if we could get the roving mics out and put your hand up if you would like to put a question forward for the experts up here on the panel. Make the most of having them here in front of you. I have one down here. They're going to run across. It's Technogym.
Yes, my name is Joe Vonk from the Netherlands. I have a question to the architects in the audience. This is a beautiful building, I agree with it. But if you talk about the Italian heritage, a lot of it you see in a lot of villages in Italy. You see a lot of different buildings, but they all have a little bit the same color of the wall and the same color of the roof. So that architecture is kind of timeless. Although this is very beautiful, I don't think this is timeless. I would think maybe in 40 years, this is not considered something where people will want to move their building or their business into. Maybe I'm wrong, because I still like it, but I would like your view on it.
Okay. Any more questions? We're going to gather them all first. And then
I would love to answer. Sorry.
Let's gather the questions first.
Hi, Whitney Austin Gray with Delos. We focus amongst many of our things the well building standards, so very close to the idea of wellness in architecture. So thrilled to see this panel. I would love for you to talk about the future of educating people. So right now in architecture schools, there's no required training on health and wellness. Likewise, within schools of public health or within medicine, little to no requirements at all around design. So as we think about the future generation, I'd like to hear your comments on how to build this into the curriculum. I should say I look out through the lens of working at Georgetown and Hopkins, and I think it's been extremely challenging. So as we sort of put this forward, how do we also train the next generation?
So your question is, should architects be trained in wellness as part of their
no, I think they should.
Yeah,
I'm definitely,
okay.
that's a yes.
Okay.
How is the answer, or question.
Any more? Should we get started? One more?
This question is to Dr. Anjan Chatterjee. I would like to know so far what has been done in the research as far as the neuroaesthetics, why you want the architects on your board to do the research, and what is happening so far. How do you connect the neuroaesthetics to the soul and the architectural design?
Okay, thank you. Any more? Should we get cracking with those? Mark?
Yeah, I mean, most of the buildings that exist, or that will exist even in 50 years, already exist now. How do we adapt these principles to retrofitting existing buildings, rather than just building for new designed with wellness into the design. So yeah, how do we do retrofitting?
Okay, that's a good set of questions. So Matteo was very keen to jump in right at the beginning on that beautiful building question. So you go.
I try very hard to answer on behalf of the Alessandri brothers. As far as I understand, you are absolutely right. This is not typical for the Italian landscape, but this company probably in the next 10, 15, 20 years is going to change radically. That's why it has to be flexible and look at the construction side where they build the machines. This will change definitely, and flexibility is a must. That's why it looks like it is. Concerning Italian architecture, I believe that the integration to the landscape is the reason why the Italian landscape, excluding cities, is still very good, because it's about botanic architecture. Nature wins over architecture. And we have to accept as architects that the nature is the winner and not the architect and the man.
Okay. Anybody else want to jump in on that question?
Well, I'm interested in not just the outside of the building, because what most people think of as architecture is actually the core and shell of the building. And this is, I think my husband said, putting the fun back into functional. This is a fun, functional building, and has every right to endure, and again, be flexible and shift and change, not too expensively when the company shifts and changes. Homes are a little bit different, and some of the most beautiful buildings in Italy are totally unlivable. People come in and decimate walls and put in steel girders and stuff like that to make the buildings livable. So I don't think anything should be kept forever, except a couple of jewels, internationally. I think life is flexible. We're changing radically from what our parents and grandparents had.
Okay.
And I would just add, change is inevitable, and it's a good thing. But again, I think that we have to be careful to maintain the cultural richness of everything, but that doesn't have to be done always in a traditional sense. You can take the essential qualities, and it can be done in a contemporary style as well.
We were talking earlier about your work looking at beauty and aesthetics and sort of what people appreciate. And one of the pieces of wisdom that was shared was that human beings don't respond well to perfection. So we like a little bit of imperfection. It makes us feel more comfortable with things. And so we had a good discussion around the value of imperfection in beauty. Would you want to sort of recap that a little bit?
So the conversation was in the context of talking about faces. We're talking about architecture here, but maybe the lesson generalizes. So in general, people prefer symmetric over asymmetric faces. But it turns out if you make the faces perfectly symmetric, which we can do now with digital means, right? You just take a half a face and you flip it over, you get a perfectly symmetric face. People get a little creeped out by that. There's something about it that doesn't feel right. They might not even know why. In some circles, in various ways, this is called the uncanny valley, which is people's preferences, they get better and better, and then there's, boom, a drop-off where they can't quite tell why. And I think it speaks to this idea of absolute perfection, that there's something artificial about it, and people respond to that without really even knowing that that's what they're responding to.
And obviously, if you're thinking about designing any kind of spa or wellness facility, you might want it to be beautiful and perfect, and so that you'll be very proud of it. But actually, there is possibly a line there that you might cross. If you make things too perfect, people might just not feel warm and comfortable towards it. So it was interesting to learn about the neuroscience behind that.
There's something too. There was a dandy called Beau Brummel who used to go out with his flounces and everything absolutely perfect, the velvet jacket and this, that, and the other. But he said perfection is boring, so he used to stain his cuff or put a little stain somewhere. And that, in a sense, you know, it's putting the humanity into architecture. As they we're messy, difficult creatures to have around, right? So we shouldn't feel that we're the only imperfect creatures in the space.
Definitely. We had a second question about educating people in wellness and, you know, the role of that. I think we would all agree that wellness should form part of architectural training, but do you have any other observations about how we can make that happen and the importance?
You're looking at me, you know. I think that it should all start as soon as people are walking. You know, they should start building and looking at things, and I think it would be wonderful if the architectural and design studios, as we do, open up for young people to come in and fiddle and play. So it should be part of your life simply, that you don't decide to be an architect or to be a designer, that as you go along through your life, all kids are artists anyway until somebody tells them they're not. So it's a question of opening up the existing offices and studios to education. And that wellness then, of course, becomes part of it automatically.
So do you think that wellness architecture should be welcoming architecture students to come in and get briefed and learn about wellness architecture? Is that something maybe that the Global Wellness Institute Wellness Architecture Initiative could get involved with?
Yes, we actually have started talking with the CEO of the National Architecture Registration Boards and have had some good interest there. But I wanted to echo what Clodagh just said. It has to start before college, before your architectural training. For those of you that aren't American, in high school, we have to take a course called Life Skills. And they were teaching me how to make pineapple upside down cakes and brownies not from the box.
You're a girl.
And there was men in that class too, but why couldn't they have been teaching us useful things like how to take care of ourselves or others or how the environment impacts us? Those would be true life skills. And then when we went into academia and started getting our undergrad and graduate degrees in architecture, we could go into the environmental psychology and the neuroscience behind how our designs impact people, because that is absolutely a problem. Right now, we're educated by the vendors that are selling us things. So we're taught that spray foam, for example, is a good thing, that it's a best practice and that it's eco-friendly. And that is very far from the truth. It's actually unhealthy for the environment and it's unhealthy for humans. So it would be easier for us to navigate those if we just had some basic awareness that lacks in society.
One other question that was,
yeah, if I could just add on to that. So this is a more general question for anybody on the panel, which is just the notion of wellness and the extent to which that notion might vary depending on the context and depending on the kind of architecture or building you're talking about. So you mentioned, you know, how a functional space like this might be very different than a home. And in that context, what we mean by wellness might be quite different. And since you, in your introduction, mentioned Hopkins and another large university, I can't remember what you said. So I work at the University of Pennsylvania, which is of the same scale, and our hospital, it's one of the oldest hospitals in the US, and it just kind of got built organically over time. And in my lab, one of the things we were interested in is spatial navigation, and we were interested in whether various kinds of vibrotactile devices help people navigate. And we used our hospital as the testing ground because it's so confusing, right? And so on the other hand, if you say, what would you want for patients who are coming into a place where they're feeling anxious, they're feeling disoriented, they're feeling like they don't know what's happening with their body, and you throw them in a place where they don't even know how to get anywhere, right? I mean, that's a kind of wellness. It's a very low bar, but I think you see this all over the place.
That comes to your point earlier about orientation in buildings.
Yeah,
We're going to go on in a minute to talk about aging and architecture and potentially talk about dementia-friendly design as well. So I think these things are all related. You know, how do we make people feel comfortable and orientated in an environment, which is very important for wellness architecture all through life. And Clodagh had some comments about your axis, I think, didn't you, and how you design around the orientation.
Yeah, I think that it's because I'm a little dyslexic and I can get lost. Like I can't find my way out of a paper bag sometimes, and I find that that signage almost always leads me astray. So I think if we can use vertical lights, for instance, in a special color that indicates the elevator. Sure, that the required signage has to be there, and obviously the braille signage, but we can do so many different kinds of signage. I mean, we're working on a project in upstate New York where there's a trail, you know, a very complicated trail. And as I say, you'll probably find me 5 days later, you know, if I went on it. But we're using artist signage. You know, when you walk through that hoop, that stone hoop, you're actually you're almost at the, you know, at the main building, that kind of thing, you know, using light and so on as signage. And there's something that interior architecture and exterior architecture and gardens and everything have to deal with, and that is giving everybody, every one of you in this audience and sitting on these chairs, ease of self in the space. You know, when you see people going around with their brows furrowed and anxiously holding tightly onto their bags, you know this is not well designed. No, you should see a visible relaxation with people when they walk into a space. I actually sit and study people a lot. I sit and study people too in places that we've designed to make sure we've done it right.
Yeah, excellent.
With what's the entrance? You know those glass buildings? And you're kind of going along like a fly to find which pane opens. No.
Did you have any comments about this?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. We, in this moment, we do a hospital for seniors. And especially if you have dementia after over 80, signage is anything written, you need strong symbols. So you remember like an arch or like a green wall, a black wall, or a tree. That's the real signage of the future.
Exactly.
I mean, we were hearing earlier that Americans are more concerned now about getting dementia than they are about getting cancer. So I think it's a big issue in terms of not only how can we prevent it and the opportunity out there for the industry to offer dementia prevention services, which seems to be potentially a huge market, particularly with an aging population, but also looking at how do we design spaces so if people are in the early stages of it, but they're still our customers, how can we welcome them and make them so that they feel just as at ease as people who are not on that journey. And also, it's going to benefit all of us to have better signposting. So could we have a little bit of a conversation about dementia-friendly design and that area, just for a few minutes?
Dementia-friendly environment?
Yeah.
I can talk some about that because we didn't do a dementia building for people with dementia, but we did building for 26 residents who were really severely handicapped. One was a screamer, somebody else was doing something else. I mean, very disruptive guys from, I think, was 17 to 70-something. And we did some intense studies on color and light and recognition and stuff like that. We discovered, for instance, if we put a photograph of the person on their door of their closet and on the door of their room, they would go straight to their room. If they were always lying on their back, we put something beautiful on the ceiling. So, because people with dementia, people with Alzheimer's love gardens and love petting plants and petting animals, stuff like that, we did a wheelchair plus walking circuit with what I call strokeable plants, the plants that felt silky, you know, lamb's ear, stuff like that, you know, that's kind of fuzzy and kind, a butterfly, you know, a butterfly tree, a buddleia tree, where were always butterflies. And, you know, and it be getting the same, I'm bringing the outdoors in and the indoors out, marrying the two, made people very, very comfortable. We did a study afterwards, and it was the screamers stopped screaming. No, we did a kitchen, although everybody wasn't, it would have been terrible if everybody was allowed to cook, but everybody was allowed to do something, you know, to do something meaningful at lunchtime, you know, or at dinner time. So it's in I think the desire in the heart to communication and to communicate and to be there stays with you. It's just it gets a little blurry in the brain, but you would know more about that than me.
Yeah, so I would say that you can use people with Alzheimer's as maybe an extreme model of what maybe makes sense for architecture in general, which is how does the environment support people for wherever they are in terms of their own flourishing, right? If you say that's the case, then you ask, what goes wrong with people with Alzheimer's disease? People have short-term memory problems. They start to have problems with interpreting densely symbolic information. By symbolic, I mean language, not pared down symbols, I think, as you were talking about. People tend to, can sometimes get sort of days and nights mixed up. There are some people that get quite motorically hyperactive and they want to move. And typically what happens in many of our nursing homes is we try to medicate people out of these, right? Which seems likely to be the wrong way to do it. And I'll give one example which speaks to your observation that people like to be in gardens. That I visited one place where wandering for some people with Alzheimer's is a big issue, and especially in our cities, it becomes a big problem if people wander out into the streets. Every now and then in the US, you'll hear a news story of so-and-so was found by the police 2 or 3 days later. Invariably, that's a person with Alzheimer's disease. So what some places have done is you still have to have the door that is exposed to the outside locked, but you can have inside inner courtyards that is still out. And what some places have done is have a lot of foliage, a lot of shrubbery, and you have these series of paths, and you don't need a large space to do this, where all the paths keep coming back to the front door, or the back door that leads into this. And so someone wants to wander, nobody stops them. They can walk around all day. They keep coming back to the entrance. That means they get physically tired. Nobody's trying to restrain them. They sleep better. And there are all these downstream consequences of that. So I think these are very simple maneuvers that if someone went in thinking of what are the problems in this population, how can we use the environment to support them in a way that we don't have to then further inhibit them by giving them tranquilizers that's going to affect their motor function, that's going to make them fall, and so on and so on.
Yeah, it's fascinating. We could talk all afternoon about it, I think.
Have you heard of the village of Hogewick? I don't know if I pronounce it properly. There's an Alzheimer's dementia village in Holland where they have a bar, they have a little store, they have a cafe. You don't leave, but you can wander around and meet people. And
you don't have to pay. You don't have to pay.
No, you don't have to pay.
Yeah.
And now the United States, I think, is starting 3 locations, 3 dementia/Alzheimer's villages. One of the things I don't understand is quite the difference between dementia and Alzheimer's. You might explain.
Sure. So dementia is just a generic term for any acquired problem with cognition. So someone who is born with developmental delays, we typically don't say that they have a dementia. So there has to be a decrement. Of the dementias, Alzheimer's disease is by far the most common. The second most common reason for dementias are having had a series of strokes. After that, things like head injuries and so on and so forth. But so dementia is just a broader category of which the single most frequent category is Alzheimer's disease.
So there's a dementia is the umbrella, let's say.
Correct.
Yeah, okay.
Can we move on to the next question? Because we've just got 10 minutes left. So Mark's question, I think, about retrofitting is very relevant to a lot of spas and wellness situations. So, you know, what do we do with all the buildings that we already have? How do we make the best of them? How do we bring them in line with all these wonderful principles that we've been talking about? Because as he said, you know, the majority of the buildings on Earth have already been built. So should we work along the row and maybe have some thoughts about retrofitting?
You just said a lot of questions. Can you do the one? Let's try them one at a time.
What do we do with the old buildings that we have? How do we retrofit them? If we start with Matteo. What's the approach?
Very difficult question because it depends on the situation. Generally speaking, as an architect, we should stop building. What does it mean? Normally, architects, we are here to build. We are here to do something new. Definitely in our world, Europe, US, and the conglomerates of China, we have to stop. That means retrofitting and condensation of cities is a must. I spend a week per month in Shanghai. Whenever I land, I don't know where I am. The city is so fast growing. It's over 45 million people. I don't know what's going to happen if they go on like this. At least in Europe, especially in Italy, we need to come back to the center of the cities. We need retrofitting, and we have to stop new building. This doesn't really answer the question.
I don't think I have anything to say about that.
Yeah, Veronica?
I would just say that any one answer is idealistic. Really, it's a case-by-case basis, and you can make a beautiful transformation in a space, but there are some spaces you just can't fix. And sometimes you do need a new building, or sometimes you may have to scrape and rebuild.
Clodagh, do you have anything to add?
I love wandering around ancient houses, you know, and with cobblestone pathways and stuff like that, with lots of bars and all those good things that the Irish love. But, you know, we got stuck with a 300-year-old cow house, and what we did, which was stone cow house, and what we did intervention. I think if you do intervention with old buildings, that you cut through, and you maybe make a glass walkway, and there's a box at the end, totally contemporary box, you know, which is, and plant all around it. You have your cozy old building with its heavy walls and everything like that, but you have them with the contemporary, and the contemporary needs echoed in certain of the rooms, and that particular room could be a loft, you know. So the old building with the tiny bedrooms, you can still have bedrooms, but you burst out into a space where everybody can grow in a very different way. Because when people didn't have central heating, the rooms were small, so they could warm them. I mean, that problem isn't there anymore, except for the course climate and so on and so forth. It's I would keep the old buildings, I must say, if they're worth keeping. But my problem is actually that in the States, for instance, the houses that sell best on new housing development ones are ones that are looking in the rear view mirror, that look like the old houses, you know, all that stuff, which is, seems to me totally out of place. Let the old be old and let the new be new.
We had a conversation earlier about how much value wellness brings to architecture in the commercial sense. So, you know, how much can you realize through your real estate, and if you add wellness in, what are your thoughts on that? You know, do you think wellness buildings are going to be more valuable than those that don't have that built in? Do we instinctively respond better to them and value them more?
Absolutely. And I believe that it's not just instinctively. We are moving towards apps and Fitbits and wearable technology that is going to be able to highlight and identify very quickly when you feel bad and you go into a building and you start buzzing. You're going to be able to prove that certain spaces you're not at your best, your cognitive performance, maybe you're having some kind of environmental reaction. So just as we've seen in the green building industry, where those buildings have higher paying, more revenue, higher occupancy, we're going to be seeing the same thing when it comes to wellness architecture.
If you had to call it, what would you say the uplift was? What's your instinct? How much value do you think it's adding as a percentage? If you had to guess.
By wellness? Well, two buildings we've done, one 3 years ago and one 10 years ago, have absolutely doubled in value in the condominiums. I mean, not just gone up 10% or 20%, but over doubled in value because the wellness amenities are there and the kitchens are designed for people who want to eat well, which means you must have a large fridge so you can pre-prepare all your vegetables, put them in glass things and so on and so forth, and come home exhausted and be able to whip together a good meal. No, people are beginning to respect that and need it.
And if you start thinking about how that doubled in relationship to the opposite that could happen, which is you being sued or having to rebuild your building, it's enormous, right?
So two sides to
There's
it,
some
definitely.
liability there.
Yeah, definitely.
There's something that's happening in office buildings. 2 office buildings in the States are now planning some amenities, like there's a 60-floor building. They're going to put in one amenities floor that everybody can use. Just pay a small maintenance fee, and that makes the building very desirable.
Definitely. Now we have 3.5 minutes left. We had a question about your research, your brain research, from the gentleman over here. So maybe we just spend that last few minutes on that question. This was finding out about the current research that's happening and the application of it.
So neuroaesthetics is a very young field. If you look at the academic literature and you look at the number of publications, it's really around 2008, 2010 that things started to take off. If you ask the same question about neuroarchitecture, we're just scratching the surface. And I think if you stick around for my talk, I'll mention some of the work we're doing, but we are at the most preliminary stages, and I think when you try to do this sort of interdisciplinary work, obviously you want to have some contact with people with domain expertise, right? So I'm not an architect, but if I'm going to try to study architectural experiences, the kinds of questions I ask, the experiments we design, will be much better informed by a real conversation, real collaboration with an architect who's also interested in how the brain might work in these domains. So I think it is too early in this field to create boundaries. Mostly what we want is for us to be as informed as possible and to learn from architects if we're going to study how people are responding to these spaces.
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, this is a fascinating area. I think we could do a whole conference on the architecture of wellness. And so, are there any final questions before we wrap up? Anything come up? No? Yeah, Sue.
So in 2 sentences, how would you make an old building well?
In 1 sentence, because we only have 1 minute and 20
In 1
seconds.
sentence, sorry. How would you make an old building well? I know what I've done. I'm just interested what they say.
I showed earlier on today, I showed a townhouse. It was 1813, I think, in the West Village. And the answer is excavation, so that the basement could be made useful. We did a survey, an environmental study on everything that came into the building and everything that was in the buildings to make sure there's no lead paint and all these things. We used the biogeometrist because of the placement of the building was rather weird, and we ended up, there was a stoop on the house. We ended up excavating and creating a new floor plate so people didn't have to clamber up steps to bring their groceries and their luggage in. So that kind of thing, and then also putting in a waterfall so the water went up through the building. And making a lot of very, very intelligent storage space. There's a lot about making buildings well.
we're running out of time. Any other quick comments about how you'd make a building well?
This morning I showed you the Marriott in Venice, 19 very old buildings. So there is, of course, in Italy, a legal problem. How do we solve that? The concept is a box in a box. So you keep the outer shell, you have a distance, a real distance, let's say this wide, so a person can pass through, and then you have the inner part of the building completely modern. That means you participate in the beauty and the patina of the history, but inside you have perfect heating, you have perfect AC, perfect lighting.
Okay, so thank you.
Brilliant.
So if anybody wants to know what Sue did to make her building well, you're very welcome to come and talk to her just here at the front. And thank you very much to all the participants in the panel. Thank you. Thank you.